Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome virtually to the Brookings Institution. My name is John Hudak. I'm a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and the Deputy Director of the Center for Effective Public Management. And it's my privilege to moderate today's panel, Election 2020, Driving Forces and Possible Outcomes. For those of you following along at home, you can join the conversation by using the Twitter hashtag Policy2020 and submit your questions by emailing events@brookings.edu or tweeting them to our team at BrookingsGov. That's BrookingsGov. So we are now 1 week away from what we hear every 4 years, and that is that this is the most important election of our lifetime. But I think it's pretty safe to say that it is definitely true this year. The candidates are quite distant ideologically. Their visions for America are quite different. And amid a global pandemic, a massive public health crisis, and an economic recession, the choice over who leads the United States over the next 4 years comes at a really monumental moment. According to the US Elections Project, 67.1 million Americans have already voted. That's the equivalent of 48.7% of all of the votes cast in the 2016 election. The polling suggests that former Vice President Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, is in a commanding position, outperforming where Hillary Clinton was 4 years ago, this far out from the election. And a lot of people are looking at this, comparing 2020 to 2016, but I think it's important to take a little bit different perspective. What people are not talking about as much is Joe Biden's polling position relative to other nominees, relative to other candidates other than Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden is about the same in the same spot as Barack Obama was, not in 2012, but in 2008. In 2008, the final Real Clear Politics polling average had Obama ahead of John McCain by 7.3%. Today, that same polling average at Real Clear Politics has Biden ahead of Trump by 7.4%. If you compare that to Obama's lead in the final average in 2012, which was Obama by 0.7%, and Clinton's in 2016, which was 3.3%, Biden's lead of 7.4% shows that this is a very different race this year. But of course, a lot can happen in a week, especially in a week that happens to be in 2020, where it seems like absolutely anything and everything can happen. And so to discuss the next 7 days, to discuss election night, the potential results, and what lies ahead, I'm joined by an amazing panel of my colleagues in governance studies today. I'll briefly introduce them and we'll jump into some questions and conversation. First, and I'll go in alphabetical order, is Sarah Bender. She's a senior fellow in governance studies. Next, Bill Galston. He's the Ezra Zilka Chair and a senior fellow. Elaine Kmark, senior fellow and director of the Center for Effective Public Management. Rayshawn Ray, a David M. Rubenstein fellow. And finally, last but not least, of course, Vanessa Williamson, who's also a senior fellow. Just as a reminder, we welcome audience engagement. So if you want to ask questions, please do so on Twitter using the hashtag Policy2020 and tagging our team at BrookingsGov or emailing them at events@brookings.edu. So first, I want to kick off with a question for everyone. What is the most important thing you'll be watching for on election night or the days leading up to it? Do you want to start, Sarah?
Sure, great. Thanks very much for including me. What's the most important thing I will be watching for? Well, as always, I am focused on Congress. I think I'll be keeping my eyes on 3 things: the Senate, and the Senate. I'm only 2/3 joking. What am I looking for? First, I think party control, as always, will matter quite a bit. Agenda control doesn't guarantee success for either party, but it is impossible to advance any part of an agenda without taking control of the majority. So, of course, in addition to who wins presidential election, the question is, if it's Biden, does he bring in a majority of the Senate? If it is the Democrats in control, how large is their caucus? Who are these new Democrats? How progressive or centrist are they likely to be? I'll be listening for discussions about whether Democrats are likely to play hardball to curb the new 6-3 conservative court. and eyes on what we can learn about the lame duck session. Spending bills for the government run out December 11th. Are they going to make a deal or kick the can? And of course, pandemic relief. What are the parties going to do as hospitals across the country and schools and so forth are overwhelmed with more COVID cases? Will the parties make a deal finally, or are they going to kick it off until after a new president is inaugurated or re-inaugurated, as it were?
Bill?
Well, like a number of other people, I'll be watching Florida. As my colleague Elaine Kamark and others have pointed out, Florida begins counting its mail-in ballots with a long lead time before Election Day, which means that reasonably comprehensive Florida returns will be available sometime in mid to late evening on election night. If Joe Biden wins Florida, no matter the margin, I think we can say with some confidence that he will be the next president of the United States. If he doesn't, and particularly if he loses by a significant margin, then I think we're in for a long night and some turbulent days after that.
Great, Elaine?
Well, of course, I was going to say Florida, but Bill comes before me alphabetically, so that's gone. So let me switch to something else. I will look at exit polls. The exit polls are going to do their best this year to include absentee ballots. So I think that they're going to do their best to have a sort of comprehensive look at the electorate. And I'm going to look at exit polls in 4 categories. How are the 2 presidential candidates performing among people who live in the suburbs? Trump won those by 4 points 4 years ago. How are the 2 candidates performing in the over 65 group, which Trump won by 7 points 4 years ago? How are they performing among independents? Trump won independents by 4 points 4 years ago. And how are they performing among white college-educated voters, where Trump won by 3 points? I think that given that it's going to take us a while, with the exception of Florida, to get good numbers on election night, the exit polls might give us sort of a sense of where this thing is going, assuming that they are doing what I've been told they will do, which is getting absentee ballots in their mix, as well as people who vote in person.
Great, Rashawn?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with my colleagues. I think that these are important issues. When I think about it, I'm thinking about voting patterns and voter suppression tactics, some things that we've actually already been seeing. On one hand, it's, of course, continuing to think about the legacy of the Shelby versus Holder decision, and also looking at states that have very stringent voter ID laws. We continue to hear about reports and see news clips of people having problems at the polls. I'm very interested as well is what's going to be happening around the mail-in ballots, particularly the boxes, whether that be in what's happening around in California, also what's happening in places like Massachusetts, where a person was found actually lighting some ballots or a box on fire, as well as what's happening directly at the polls, John. As you know, in our great state of Tennessee, in Memphis, where I happen to go to college at, there were reports of people showing up in Black Lives Matter shirts being turned away. And so I'm very interested in those particular types of tactics, along with details about very long lines. I mean, traditionally, we like to talk about long lines as being emblematic of voter suppression tactics. But in 2020, I think even in places that are predominantly Black and tend to be more democratic or progressive, also have fewer polling places aiming to gear people toward mail-in ballots. But we're seeing a lot of people come out throughout the country in, as you noted, historic ways. And I'm also very interested in voting patterns, similar to Elaine's point, looking at these exit polls. I mean, what's been happening over the past week, particularly when we look at demographics around education, around race in particular, and the gender divide between Black women and Black men. I mean, in 2016, 1 out of 6 college-educated Black men voted for Donald Trump. When we start to see polls about younger Black people, nearly 20% reporting being favoring Donald Trump in areas where we know the Black vote really matters in certain states, whether that be in North Carolina or Pennsylvania. And then, of course, going down to Florida, thinking about the Black vote, but particularly thinking about Latinos in that state where Trump is literally polling extremely well with those demographic groups, much better than people think. So those are the particular things I'm going to be looking at. And I mean, on one hand, I think when it comes to election night, if Biden is ahead, it could be considered that he's going to probably win. If it's extremely close, I mean, look, we could have the 2000 election on steroids again. And I think for a lot of us, we'll be paying a lot of attention.
Great. Vanessa?
Yeah, I'm just going to follow up on what Rayshon said. The first election I voted in was the one that ended with Bush v. Gore, so it's always sort of in the forefront of my own mind. And I think voter suppression is going to be the story, or perhaps its lack of impact in the best case scenario. But I think that delays, long lines, counting procedures and court cases that can result from that, reports of people being turned away, these are all things to be looking for in the days leading up to and the day of the election. I think that's definitely going to be the key story. And I mean, one of the questions is how much mobilization and enthusiasm can overcome institutional barriers, right? Because we've seen so many institutional barriers put in place, including everything from voter ID laws, purges of the voting rolls, and a whole series of maneuvers that have made it more difficult physically to vote, especially under COVID conditions. But there's more coming down the pike. We've got to think about elections in the future. We're going to be thinking about the effect of ending the census early, damage that's been done to the post office that could have long-term implications. And the longer we're operating under pandemic conditions, there'll be a real need to revise the way that we approach voter registration more generally. So I think that the voting procedures and voter suppression are definitely my top story on election night.
Vanessa, I want to stick with you and pick up on the point you were making at the beginning of that answer. As I noted at the outset, according to the University of Florida's Michael McDonald's U.S. Elections Project, 67.1 million Americans have already voted, and that number is certainly higher. It's probably gone up since we started this panel. What does that tell you about America's response to the current crisis and what you think it might mean for the election itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an election in which many people are very, very highly motivated, and it makes sense. The stakes of the election are extraordinarily high. The question to me is how to take account of early voting in a pandemic versus early voting as we typically see it, right? I mean, because you definitely can't assume that the numbers we're seeing this year are equivalent to the numbers we would have seen in earlier years. Simply because vastly more people would like to vote early. Some states have moved entirely to mail-in voting. And so I think that it's risky to draw conclusions from the data we've seen so far, especially when it's quite hard to assess what sort of turnout we're actually going to see on election day.
Bill, you've written a bit about turnout, about enthusiasm, about different demographic groups responding to the current crisis. Do you have anything to add?
Well, I agree with Vanessa that it's risky, but I will take a deep breath and take the risk. I think the turnout is going to be massive this year. I note with interest that turnout in the 2018 midterms was the highest for more than 100 years. And when I take a look at the measures of voter enthusiasm across the board, they're off the charts. Many of them show voter enthusiasm higher than it was in 2008, where Democratic enthusiasm for Barack Obama was sky high. I also think it's significant that in many of the swing states, the mail-in ballots plus the people who voted early represent an astonishing percentage of the total 2016 vote. I just saw a report today that in Texas, when you add together the mail-in ballots plus the early voting, you already have 82% of the total vote cast in 2016. And in many of the swing states, it's about 2/3. So I am pretty confident. There were about 137 million votes cast in 2016. I think the minimum this year is 150, and along with others, I wouldn't be surprised to see 160. And this means that the counting is going to take a while in the states that don't allow, early or mail-in ballots to be counted until election day. But this election, I think, is one that historians are going to be, and political scientists are going to be talking about for a long time because of the massive outpouring of Americans who are determined to vote and determined that their votes will count and will matter. You just read reports from around the country. What are people saying as they're standing on those lines or dropping their mail-in ballots, into collection boxes or mailboxes? They're saying in almost the same words from coast to coast, I'm doing this because I want to make sure that my vote counts. I've never seen anything like this.
Rashawn, I'd like to pick up on that point. You noted in the opening about real deep concerns about voter suppression that are not unique to this election. There are entire groups of people who are subject to voter suppression tactics. It is more intense in some states or some localities than it is in others. And it really becomes a motivating factor. There are organized groups that use that as a call to, essentially a call to arms, to motivate people, especially people of color in the United States, to get out. It's something when you hear interviews with Black and brown voters, it is something that they talk about, whether they're waiting in line for 5 hours, whether they're walking to the mailbox to drop a ballot in. Have you found that messaging to be effective? And what do you think the impact of voter suppression tactics clashing with enthusiasm will mean this year?
I think to Bill's point, the knowledge and enthusiasm around voting, and really it's people literally, I think, embodying John Lewis when he talked about, I spilled a little blood for the right to vote. I've heard a lot of people say that. A lot of people are aiming to embody that right now. And the lines that we're seeing, particularly when people can send in mail-in ballots, speaks to the distrust that people have of the election process and the democratic process that exists in the United States. And we have to be very clear that it's a collective memory of rational distrust that people actually have of the election process, that people literally want to see their actual ballot go in the machine. And I mean, they have a right to necessarily see that, and they have a right to actually view things in the way they do. I mean, if we go back to 2018, just a couple of years ago, for a lot of people vividly remember what happened in the governor's races in Florida and Georgia. There are a lot of people who think that different people should actually be in those positions. I mean, it took Stacey Abrams a very long time in Georgia to actually, well, I'm not sure if she actually really conceded. I mean, she did say that voter suppression was actually something that was at play that prevented her from being able to take that particular position. So I think when we highlight this, what we're seeing across the board are extremely, extremely long lines. But we're also seeing people pay attention to the process in a way they haven't before either. It doesn't mean that people didn't go out to vote, but I've been speaking to people who are extremely knowledgeable about the mail-in ballot process, that absentee process, and also voting in person. And part of them being knowledgeable oftentimes can fuel their skepticism about whether or not their vote would actually count. And in particular, I mean, what we're really being specific about is that particularly in low-income communities, Black and Latino communities, we know these things are more likely to happen. People realize that the place down the street from them that used to allow them to vote isn't open anymore, and they have to stand in a line for hours, and people are willing to do it. And I think we have to pay attention to that, but we also have to ask ourselves whether that should be even something that people should have to go through.
Bill, I want to jump back to you quickly, and I'll start the question with you and open it up to anyone else who wants to chime in. One of the burning questions for Americans this year, and one of the issues, especially for Democrats, is their fear of what happened in 2016. Confidence going into Election Day, confidence in looking at the polls, and then having a real surprise outcome at the end of the night. It's something that I hear from family, from friends, getting questions about this. I'm sure all of you do too. So I guess the question is Biden really ahead? Should we believe the polls, or are we in for a November surprise again?
Well, every Democrat I know has suffered from political PTSD for at least 4 years, and I can just self-report, that there's a real tension between my head, which is optimistic, and my gut, which is queasy. Having said that, I think there's reason to put more weight on the polls this time than there was 4 years ago. And there are a number of reasons for that, but just let me put the big one on the table. The principal source of error in the statewide polls was the underestimate of the number of whites without a college education who had participated in 2016, and an overestimate of the number of whites with a college education. And they got it wrong, not just by a little, but by a lot. The polling community has gone to school on that mistake. And when a new poll comes out and I'm talking with one of the people who put it together, I always ask them, well, what does your turnout model look like? What are you assuming in particular about the division between college educated and non-college educated whites? And they have almost unanimously raised their models of non-college educated voting to correspond to the actual outcome in 2016. So unless it's the case that this year's outcome, this year's turnout from that group will be even higher than it was as a share of the total electorate, I think we can put some real weight and confidence into the polls. In addition, I've done a lot of comparisons between the national polls and the statewide polls, and the results, particularly in the swing states, are remarkably consistent. Indeed, just a couple of days ago, I drilled down to the congressional district level, and in just about every case, Biden's gains over Clinton 4 years ago, or the Democratic aspirant's gains over the Democrat 4 years ago, have gone up by roughly the same amount. Joe Biden is doing, let's say, 7 points better than Hillary did, at least on the 538 model. And that 7-point improvement is pretty much across the board. So unless you're talking about a massive systemic polling error, which was not the case in 2016 when the national polls were right and it was the state polls that were wrong, unless you're talking about a massive systemic error, I think it is safe to say that Joe Biden is ahead right now. And not only that, and I'll conclude on this point, to a degree that I think nobody anticipated, Joe Biden is on offense and President Trump is on defense. And what I mean by that is that as of this afternoon, Joe Biden is leading in 8 states and 2 congressional districts that Donald Trump carried in 2016. And he is competitive in 3 states, Texas, Iowa, and Ohio, that Mr. Trump won overwhelmingly in 2016. I mean, this is such a consistent pattern that I think you can have some confidence in it.
And a pattern that's generally held since the spring. This is not something that has happened right at the end of the cycle. Biden's lead, if you look at not just the polling average, but the length of that average, you see an unbelievably stable race, especially for all of us who have been watching elections for some time. To see a race just that steady over the course of 8, 9, 10 months is pretty remarkable. I just want to offer to everyone else, if you have anything else you wanted to add on polls or Democratic heartburn, et cetera.
Yeah, I jump in on that. I think that one thing to remember also is that far fewer people will be voting on election day than in the past, right? So there's actually less room for last minute surprises. as more and more people have, whether they wanted to change their mind or not, will not be able to, no matter what the president says on that subject. The votes are already being counted, and being counted in a lot of places that will really matter for the election.
Sarah, I'd like to turn to you. The election, as you said in your opening remarks, is about more than just Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Congressional races are critical as well. Democrats are widely expected to retain control of the House, but the Senate's a different story. The map has expanded significantly over the course of this cycle. When the cycle first started, there was a sort of outside chance that Democrats would take the Senate. Now it looks like they might be the odds-on favorite. Could you talk a little bit about the landscape of Senate races right now and what some possible political and partisan alignments might look like when the new Congress gavels in January?
Sure. Well, I think there are a couple of forces we should keep in mind when we're trying to figure out which way these elections are likely to go, both individually and collectively for the parties. I think the most dominant thing we've learned has been the rise over the last 30 plus years in the sheer partisanship of voting, both how you vote for your House member, for the House race, how you vote in the Senate race, and when there's a president on the ballot. Those are highly, highly correlated at the individual level of the voter. And so what does that look like? It looks like most Senate races go the same way as your state's presidential vote goes. To the degree that in 2016, every single Senate race, the party that won the Senate race also won the presidency, right? 100%. Compare that back to the early 1980s, the numbers were closer to like 40%. So, and there are lots of reasons why we've seen that rise in partisanship, but what does it mean? It really means if Biden wins the presidency, he most likely will also have a majority Democratic Senate. It seems less likely that if he ends up winning, it seems unlikely that Democrats would get over the hurdle to have a majority. So party matters here, partisanship matters for sure. There are couple other forces just to keep in mind here, always differential in money in campaign funds here. And I'm not a real elections person, so I haven't drilled down into the balance here, but we've certainly seen as part, I think, a backlash in some states to the Amy Coney Barrett nomination, just infusion of millions of dollars into these contested Senate races. And also candidates matter. And I think you'll see a little bit of that if you think about which are the purplish or swinger or sometimes red states in which Democratic candidates, challengers, in fact, are doing well, whether it's Bullock in Montana, Cunningham in North Carolina. These aren't flaming liberal progressives. They fit the more mixed ideological nature of these states. So the combination of candidates' money and sheer partisanship with what appears to be a large Biden lead may in fact produce a Biden win and a Democratic Senate. Or PTSP or whatever we're calling it from 2016, maybe not. What does it, why is that consequential? I think that obviously the big issue will be, if there's a Democratic majority, what will the Senate Democrats do in coordination with a Democratic House and with a Democratic White House? How will they respond to what they see as an unfair advantage amongst Republicans, essentially stacking the Supreme Court and slowly stacking the federal courts? And do the Democrats have it within them? Do they have enough cohesion to play what we now call hardball? Are they willing to be as aggressive in bending rules and norms as Republicans have been? Whether that means adding states, changing laws to admit Puerto Rico and DC, whether it means expanding the court, whether it means nuking the legislative filibuster in order to restore the Voting Rights Act. I think one question here, of course, is how, if there is a Democratic majority and unified Democratic control, how do Republicans respond? Do they look like the Republicans in the Senate looked in response to Obama, which almost from day one was not to cooperate, not to, so that nothing looked bipartisan? If that's what we see, then Democrats won't get much done outside of appointments and outside of the regulatory process, which they can do without Republican consent. So much rides on a Democratic majority here for any prospects of a Biden successful presidency, but also party control is not enough. They have to be on the same page if they think they're really going to play hardball like the Republicans have shown that they can.
To add to one of your points, Sarah, about the motivation, particularly financially, that has happened for Democrats during this Supreme Court fight, Act Blue, which is the clearinghouse for Democratic donations, in the 39 days since Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed, has raised about $2 billion for candidates across the United States, from Joe Biden down the list. That is a remarkable fundraising haul, and you see it in some huge numbers from Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, from Sarah Gideon in Maine, and of course, Vice President Biden setting consecutively the largest fundraising haul months in presidential campaign history. That motivation has really been significant. Elaine, I'd like to turn to you next. As I mentioned in my question to Bill, as we all know, Democrats are terrified to get their hopes up this year because of the memories of what happened in 2016. You're a veteran of presidential campaigns, of observing presidential campaigns, working on them, et cetera. Does this feel like 2016 to you, or is there a better comparison year to what the state of play is right now?
Thanks, John. It does not feel like 2016. 2016 was close. And in 2016, there were two things going on. There was the analysis coming out of the Hillary Clinton campaign headquarters in Brooklyn, which was based on algorithms, was based on math, it was based on past voting and anticipation and models, et cetera. And then there was the nervousness coming out of tried and true campaign operatives in the Democratic Party who had run states in the last 3 or 4 presidential campaigns. One of them saying, there's one story, one of them telling me how he went to Michigan and reported back nothing was happening. There was nothing on the ground. There was no energy. It wasn't there. There was a problem. It was a real problem in Michigan. And of course, primarily in Wayne County, which is Detroit. And that sort of feel, if you will, right, for the election was reported by many people with lots of background in political campaigns. And it ran straight up against a kind of, mathematical notion of campaigns, obviously based in part, as Bill explained so nicely, on a sort of wrong turnout assumptions that turned out not to be what happened in 2016. So there was considerable nervousness. There was considerable nervousness among Democratic Party veterans in 2016. And that included, by the way, the former president himself, Bill Clinton, we always said was one of the best political strategists ever. He was nervous about it. So everybody was feeling that something was not quite right. I don't see that this time. Okay, people, there is a sense that it's going. There's a sense that there's momentum. There's a sense that the party is coming together around Biden, and that this may extend down through Senate races, and that there may be a pickup in the House, by the way, of maybe as many as 10 seats, and that House members who got elected in 2018 in tough districts, in purple districts, sometimes in red districts, it looks like a lot of them are going to hold their seats. So there seems to be strength all through the ticket. And a little bit of this, by the way, is, and I had this conversation just yesterday with a real experienced Democratic operative who said that, you know, the lesson is in real politics lately is that you want to build your strength from bottom up as well as top down. It used to be this was all about coattails, it was all about the presidential strength. Democrats, I think, have learned a lesson that the Republicans started learning earlier, which is that you have to get real candidates in every single one of these districts, even if they're not expected to win. Because when you have a real candidate, instead of just giving up on the district because, oh, it's so Republican, when you have a real candidate on the district, guess what? They're pulling votes. They're pulling votes and they're helping the ticket from the bottom up. So that seems to be one of the dynamics going on this year that wasn't last year. There seems to be something real happening. And I think we see it in all the other indicators besides polls, like, for instance, just the amount of money coming in small donations, which is quite overwhelming.
Bill, I know you've thought a lot about you know, what this year feels like relative to other years, what the candidates are like relative to past presidential candidates. Do you want to weigh in about your feelings around this race and its sort of historical nature? Got to unmute.
Indeed, I do. Thank you, John. First of all, on the contrast between 2016 and 2020, let me just add one point to the list that Elaine put on the table. To a degree that I think is quite remarkable and reflects skillful management by Joe Biden and his campaign, a potentially divided party has come together to a very high degree. I saw a survey just last week to the effect that about 95% of the people who supported Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren during the battle for the nomination this year intend to vote for Joe Biden. The process that the Biden campaign set in motion, putting these issues task forces together, I think turned out to be a bonding experience for parts of the party that were really at loggerheads 4 years ago, and some real meeting of the minds on issues, at least on paper, occurred during that process as well. And I think that contributed to the across-the-board support that Joe Biden is getting from moderate Democrats all the way through to left-leaning progressives within the party. Another remarkable fact is indications that moderate Republicans are breaking ranks. And for example, the last time I checked, 8 former Republican governors had endorsed Joe Biden. And they weren't just from the Northeast. They were from the Northeast, the Midwest, and even Montana, where Mark Rasko, who was, after he was governor of Montana, the chair of the Republican National Committee, endorsed Joe Biden, which leads to a broader point. It is possible that Trump is forcing a realignment, an actual classic realignment, where more educated voters, many but not all of them in the suburbs, are breaking their historic ties with the Republican Party and are now adopting the Democratic Party at least as their default position. If the Biden presidency, if there is one, confirms their hopes as opposed to their fears about the Democratic Party, then this potential realignment could turn into an actual realignment. This could be an extremely significant election in that regard, because that would mean a shift in the plate tectonics of politics in the United States. And I have compared Donald Trump in 2020 to William Jennings Bryan in 1896, as someone who is mounting a desperate rear guard action against an emerging new America. That's true on the economic front. It's also true on the demographic front. So stay tuned, but this could be a big one, folks.
So just as a reminder to those of you viewing, we'll transition to audience questions in a bit, but make sure to get those questions in. You can tweet them to our team using the Twitter hashtag Policy2020 and tagging us at @BrookingsGov, or emailing your questions to events@brookings.edu. Rayshawn, I'd like to turn to you next on a bit of a different topic. The issue of race has really transformed the political and policy conversations in the United States this year. The killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others have generated protests. They've led to state and local level reforms and thrust issues of justice to the center of the national policy conversation. What role do you think these issues will have on the election? And just as important, how do you think they'll reshape the agenda of the new Congress and for the person who's sworn in on January 20th?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's shaping it fully. I think part of what's happening is that on one hand, we are seeing the pettiness of politics and a particular point of political theater that people really want to get past and beyond because people's lives are being lost. When it comes to COVID-19, for example, if Blacks and whites had the same death rate, there would be nearly 25,000 fewer Black people who've died from COVID-19 in 2020. I mean, that is hitting many people's families, many people's social networks. And part of what it means is people are coming out into the streets. And I'll go back to Tennessee as an example. Normally don't give this many Tennessee examples, but my hometown of Murfreesboro, Tennessee really highlights this. My godbrother was out just doing simple things like home improvement stuff. He's seen some people set up for Trump trying to get out the right to vote. And then Black Lives Matter protests came up to counter them. Simultaneously, while that was happening, a person brought out a Confederate flag. And then the people set up for Trump said, no, we don't need that out here. All of the people who were out here in this moment were white. This is in the middle of Tennessee. I say this to say there were a lot of Black people and Latinos observing this in this moment, because obviously one of the things we know about these protests is that obviously people have been protesting for Black lives, whether it be about police brutality, but it's been broader than that. And we've started to see a rainbow coalition of people coming out during these protests that we haven't seen before. And the movement for Black lives has been able to galvanize people in such a short period of time, partly by the way they've been able to use social media in ways that we haven't seen in the United States or around the world. There are a couple of demographic groups I'm paying attention to. I mentioned the ones before, Blacks and Latinos, obviously, but I'm also paying attention to young people, particularly young white voters, in addition to young Black, Latino, and Asian voters who I think are coming out in droves. Now, it's going to be interesting to pay attention to what their voting patterns are. Like, are they sending in mail-in ballots, or are they showing up at the polls? What I've kind of just visually been seeing is they're really engaging in early voting. They want to come out. Many of them are voting for the first time, so they want to do that in person. The other group I'm paying attention to, and we've essentially been alluding to it, but it's the 11% of whites who voted for Obama in 2012, who then switched to Trump in 2016. What is happening with them? And what they're seeing as it relates to police brutality and racism in America is something that they also want to hopefully put to bed and correct, because they are oftentimes raising children in this world and in a society where they tell their children that you treat people based on how they act and who they are, not necessarily what they look like. And they're having to look at their children in the eyes and tell them that they're lying to them. And that's something that people don't like. And Trump has tried to combat that, right? He's aimed to speak directly to people in suburbia. I mean, even calling out women who are staying at home, taking care of children. So he's not only sending dog whistles, but he's sending loud bullhorns. And into the Black community, similar to this realignment that Bill is talking about, I think we're seeing this across the board, even among Black people. that there is this continuous growing demographic of Black people who have a disdain for the Democratic Party, who are looking at the Republican Party. They don't like that either. They're looking at candidates, but what they are doing, they're looking down ballots. And I think once they fill out ballots and once they get to the poll, if they're voting for a down ballot candidate who's more likely to be Democrat, I think they'll probably also vote for Biden, even though they're understanding they can make their vote and still critique him and his ticket at the same time.
Vanessa, you've done a lot of research on voter registration, voter suppression, et cetera. There have been real efforts at the legislative level, but really at the grassroots level over the past several election cycles, not just to focus on voter turnout, but really to focus on getting individuals registered, making sure that they're informed about the processes in their state, whether it's voting in person, voting by mail now, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about how those efforts have played out and what impact you think they might have on this election?
That's right. So I think that what we see at the state level in terms of voting is a real dichotomy between states that have moved towards a model of voter suppression. Many of those states were previously states that had oversight of their voting decisions. That was taken away with the Shelby decision in 2013. So we have states that are moving towards voter suppression and other states that are moving towards voter access. So you're seeing automatic voter registration programs put in place in a lot of states, fully implemented already in a few. And voter registration's history in the United States is caught up in the history of trying to keep African Americans from the polls, right? So the move towards automatic voter registration is a repudiation, finally, of that history. And I think it's incredibly important. So we're seeing this dichotomy between the states that have moved towards voter access and the states that have continued or reverted really to voter suppression policies. In terms of what we're going to see this year, there is, the sort of new suppression that results from the pandemic, right? So whereas before you had to institute new voter ID laws, you had to close polling places explicitly, to make it harder to vote. Now, with pandemic conditions, you can imagine it becomes harder to vote, even if the state weren't trying to make it worse. So that's, I think, the fundamental dynamic that we're seeing, but it intersects, as several of my fellow panelists have said, with this mobilization. Right. And I think that one of the things that the Trump presidency, much like the Trump campaign in 2016, but it's certainly validated by the presidency itself, it's pulled the Band-Aid off on racism in America. So if people were able to convince themselves that these problems were somehow in the past, the rhetoric of the president, the decisions of the Republican Party have really, they should have called that into question for anyone who thought we had put those days behind us.
Thanks, Vanessa. Sarah, I'd like to turn back to you and turn back to Congress. As we talked about, Democrats have a pretty good chance of taking back majority control of the Senate next year. And you noted that earlier. One of the ideas that's being floated out there in terms of institutional reform involves the elimination of the filibuster. Could you talk a little bit about how that process would work from a technical perspective within the Senate? And whether you think that that's a smart political move if Democrats were to do that upon taking control.
Sure. So the terminology we tend to use is the use of the nuclear option. And what does that really mean? Well, you could imagine two different ways of changing Senate rules. And the rule that everyone is focused on is Rule 22. What do we have to know about it? That's the cloture rule. It sets the threshold, how many votes are required to cut off debate. And so the rule, if you picked up the rule book today, it still says that it requires 60 votes to cut off debate on any measure or nomination. There's another clause in there to change the rules to cut off debate on a resolution to change the rules. That requires 67 votes, a 2/3 majority. So when we talk about changing Senate rules, we mean one of two things. One is that we that senators might just follow the rules to change the rules. And what would that look like? Well, you open up the rule book and Rule 22, the cloture rule would say, well, you need 67 votes to cut off debate on a motion to ban the filibuster. And of course, neither party has 67 votes, and neither party is going to give, the opposition party is not going to give any votes to the majority party to take away their rights under the rules. So instead, what we saw in 2017 with Republicans and with Democrats in 2013, when they used the nuclear option, was, and this is just gets us into hocus pocus Senate rules, they reinterpreted the rule. So where you see 60 in the rule, 60 votes to cut off debate on a Supreme Court nomination, they reinterpreted 60 to mean a simple majority, which in essence is 50 or 51. What do I mean? They reinterpreted the rule. They created what we call a precedent, an interpretation of the rules. And all those precedents get recorded. Majority votes in this instance with the Supreme Court nomination, the rule of 60 means 51. That sounds crazy, but what does it mean? It means the majority finds a way to bend the rules, dodge the rules, warp the rules. They're not actually formally changing rules, they're just reinterpreting the rules. And that takes a simple majority. So the question is it possible that the Democrats could decide, if they gain the majority with Biden in the White House, to nuke the rest of the filibuster rule that has not been touched, because the Democrats and the Republicans so far have only touched portions of the rule that relate to nominations, to confirm the executive and judicial branch nominations. But that leaves a whole range of Senate action on amendments, legislative motions, procedural motions, a whole range of the types of votes that have to be taken in order to pass legislative measures. So what would it look like? Well, it would look roughly the same as probably as what we saw with nuking the Supreme Court, the nomination filibusters, which is that there would be some effort, there would be a filibuster of, say, pick your poison, let's say adding 2 seats to the Supreme Court. Republicans would filibuster, and there would be a set of procedural steps where Democrats would essentially reinterpret the rule on the floor and look and say, under the rules, you only need 51 to cut off debate on a legislative motion. And then the presiding officer would actually read the rule book and he'd say, no, he or she would say, no, it takes 60. And then there'd be a procedural challenge on the floor. And the majority would say, no, 51. And the minority would try to appeal it and they'd lose. So procedurally, that's what we would see. It's a reinterpretation of the rules on the floor. And the key here is it takes 51 or it takes a simple majority. And so the question is, if there's a Democratic majority, how many seats do they have? Who are in those seats? Who's 50? Who's 51? Who's number 52? Are these moderates? Do they agree with the target of nuking the filibuster? And of course, the potential cost here, it's not just whether or not you support the particular legislative motion, say, to expand the court, but then there's no filibuster constraint for anything else that Democrats want to do or a future Republican majority wants to do. And majorities find the filibuster helpful themselves. Individual senators can challenge and use the rule to slow things down they don't like. And of course, majorities like it, they can blame the other side for blocking them. So it's not a done deal by any stretch of the imagination, even if Democrats come in with a robust Democratic majority.
Vanessa, I want to pick up on the point of the prospect of Republicans losing the House, the Senate, and the presidency. We've seen some real divisions in the Republican Party this year, with people like Cindy McCain and John Kasich endorsing Joe Biden, the Lincoln Project, a coalition of Republicans and former Republicans who oppose President Trump, putting out some of the most memorable ads of this cycle. If the results do break in that direction, a real blue wave, what do you think those results will mean for the future of the Republican Party, and how do you think the Republican Party responds?
It's a great question. One thing we've seen with the Republican Party in recent cycles, and I have done some work on this dating back to the Republican backlash to Obama that was known as the Tea Party and earlier, one of the things that we've seen with the Republican Party is at an elite and grassroots level, a willingness to abandon norms and rules of democratic process to win. And so I think we're seeing obviously an increasingly extreme version of that now. And that begs the question of whether what is supposed to happen, which is that when a party consistently loses, it adjusts its positions and preferences to win elections, is whether those controls continue to sort of apply, or whether the sort of commitment to rule from a minority position, which is the sort of rationale for ensuring as much control as possible in the judicial branch, winning, being comfortable winning seats without winning majority of the vote, relying on things like the Electoral College and the Senate in their sort of anti-majoritarian aspects to continue to hold sort of substantial power over the agenda of the federal government. Now, the question is whether the Republican Party is whether a substantial defeat would readjust those priorities, and there are clearly individuals, at least in some organizations, that have suggested the Republican Party has gone too far in various ways. Bill talked about earlier some of those leaders. The question I think that remains open is how much support those individuals have, either institutionally or in terms of voter support. You'll remember that in 2016, the Republican field was extremely crowded, but Donald Trump was the front runner. People did not want to think about that as the case, but the numbers said it quite clearly that Donald Trump was the front runner and never was substantially challenged from that position. So I think that the Republican Party really requires a reckoning if it is to operate within democratic norms that that democracies prefer to operate within. The Republican Party has a reckoning. It's not, though it is clear that there are individuals and some groups that are willing to sort of break ranks at this point. It is not, I think, at the level where I would describe it as a faction even of the Republican Party in terms of its level of organization or power within the party.
All right, I'm going to remind our audience to get your questions in, either emailing events@brookings.edu or sending them in by Twitter using the hashtag policy2020 and tagging @BrookingsGov. I'm going to have one more question for our panelists before I jump into some audience questions. I'll start with you, Elaine, but please anyone else should feel free to jump in. I want to get back to election night itself. In 1 week and about 5 hours, polls are going to start to close on the East Coast. How do you see election night unfolding, and what are some of the possible scenarios you see playing out?
Well, I see election night unfolding in different ways for different states. And that's why sort of having an idea of what's red, what's blue, and what's swing will be important, I think, for people watching election night. There will be states like Florida, as Bill mentioned, where we're going to have a pretty good idea a couple hours past poll closing as to what's happened in Florida. There are going to be other states where, because the list of absentee voters is available to the exit poll company, they will actually have pretty decent exit polls of the vote. There will be other states where they're going to be guessing, they're going to have to do massive phone calling to find out the absentee voters, and the exit polling isn't going to be very reliable. So it's going to be a real mixed bag. On the other hand, the one thing I think that, and there's been a lot of hysterical, scenarios playing out on the internet, in articles, et cetera, about the chaos that could be election night. I think what we have to remember is the presidential candidate only has to get to 270. So if the presidential candidate gets to 270, there could be 4 or 5 states where it's a mess, where the votes are being counted for a week. There's lots of challenges, et cetera. There could be down ballot races that really take a long time to unfold. But I have a feeling that we will have a pretty good idea on election night of somebody either being at 270 or being well on their way to 270. I did hear a panel last week that included the secretaries of state of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And they all said the same thing. They were asked, what's the latest date you think you'll have the votes counted by? And they said Friday. They said Friday after the Tuesday election. So I think we're going to know on election night. We'll have a pretty good idea of what's going on. The nightmare scenario is an election that is so incredibly close that we're back to Florida in 2000. And from everything we're seeing right now, that doesn't look to be the case, at least in a lot of states. Or if we do have an incredibly close election, it could be in a state like Ohio, which Trump won last time, but he doesn't need to win this time anyway. So that's what I think will be the focus for election night and for the days after.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in, or we can jump to audience questions?
I'd add two quick things. One, I think one of the things that'll be interesting to see is how the media covers this, because it will matter whether, it certainly mattered in 2000, when the media decides to call states, more or less, when it decides to call elections. That is something that I would imagine has been a subject of a great deal of consideration in the newsrooms, and something that ideally people are taking as a very sober responsibility this year. The other thing I'd say is that the control of the Senate might be something that's not obvious for quite some time. A thing that mattered for the Obama administration was the seats that got held up. And I'll pass to Sarah to remind me, but Russ Feingold's seat, isn't that right, was held up in 2000 for quite some time. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly? But there was one fewer votes for the early part of ACA, as I remember, than there could have been if that election weren't held.
Well, Minnesota, the Al Franken seat didn't get counted basically till 4 or 5 months in, I think.
Yeah, took a long time. Mm-hmm.
There's the prospects of potentially two runoff elections in Georgia, which are after the new Senate gets seated. One of those seats, Perdue, would be empty because his term would be over. But I think the appointed Senator Loeffler, a little hard to interpret Georgia state law, but I think she stays onto those seats until the winner is actually certified. So that first week could be quite complicated.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We'll transition now to audience questions. I'll put the question out there, and any of you who want to chime in, feel free to do so. One question I've gotten in several different forms from multiple people asks about foreign interference in the election. Last week, the DNI and the FBI director held a joint announcement. It really wasn't a press conference, but an announcement of active interference efforts from Russia and Iran. Some of our viewers have asked what impact, if any, you think foreign interference may have on voters' attitudes, voters' choices, their decision to turn out, and ultimately the election.
I'll take that, John. I think that 2016 was a perfect storm. And to use a lesson from military science and from war, whenever you have a brand new weapon, you win. And the other side doesn't have it, you win. You win by surprise, you win lack of preparedness. I think 2016 was extraordinary in that we had never seen foreign interference on the scale that we saw it in 2016. And because it was so new, the campaign themselves, people in the Hillary Clinton campaign told me, they heard these Pizzagate rumors and they just laughed. They thought, it was some nonsense that you hear on the internet and we don't really have to do anything about that. The fact of the matter is that in a close election, like when you're losing Michigan by all of 10,000 votes, you don't need a lot of people to believe in Pizzagate. You just need a couple thousand people to believe in Pizzagate. So that was an extraordinary situation. I do think that the electorate is more sophisticated and the campaigns are more sophisticated. And as we've seen, there's a lot of pressure being placed on Facebook and Twitter to at least try and tamp down some of the more blatant disinformation. Now, my worry about foreign interference is I think that their persuasion ability, they're going to meet some skepticism with. What I'm worried about with foreign interference is the plain old garden variety of dirty tricks, which we have seen for centuries in American politics. And the plain old garden variety is you tell the voters that the date for voter registration is this day, not that day. You tell the voters that they can vote up until 10 o'clock p.m. on election day, not 7 o'clock p.m. I mean, these things are just classic. Everybody's used them for many decades. And guess what? The internet makes it even easier to use them. We have seen already that the Russian interference has been mimicking Trump's line about mail-in voting, and I wouldn't be surprised if they are adding to the confusion about how to vote by mail, when the deadlines are, when you have to put your ballot in the mail, all of that stuff. So what I worry about in terms of the foreign interference is that we have a different kind of perfect storm. We have an election where there's a lot of people are voting in a different way than they already have. So that already means people are going to make mistakes. Just happens. They're not going to sign that envelope on the absentee vote to send it, the privacy envelope, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got that problem going on. And then you have the Russians trying to confuse the situation even more. They are not doing voter education, believe me. They're trying to do voter uneducation. And I think that is a really potentially frightening prospect. And I think it's very real. I think that we are more alert to that than we were 4 years ago. But I also think it's a very, very hard thing, as we know, to stop. So the combination of new ways of voting and then disinformation about those new ways of voting, I think could be really disastrous if it's a close election.
And for those of our viewers interested, last year, Brookings put out a cybersecurity and election interference series on our website. You can go to brookings.edu and find that for some great up-to-date information on those types of efforts and the American government's ability, as well as campaigns' abilities to combat some of those efforts. Another question from multiple viewers focuses on unity, or the prospects of unity. Whoever wins the election next week will govern over a closely and deeply divided country. Polarization, protests over issues like racial and economic justice, the rise in domestic terrorism are all significant challenges that the next president will face. How capable do you feel that President Trump in his second term or Mr. Biden in his first term could heal the wounds of this nation?
I'll take that one. At least I'll start. And I mean this as a political science analysis and not a partisan statement. Donald Trump's modus operandi as a candidate and throughout his first term as president was not to unify. It was to heighten the contradictions, to raise passions on both sides. I don't think that was a strategy that he can simply turn off at will. I think it's an important part of who he is. And so I would not rate the chances of unity in a second Trump term as being any higher than they turned out to be in the Trump in the Trump first term. By contrast, Joe Biden, throughout his career in public life, has believed in working with people on the other side of the aisle. Sometimes his critics charge excessively so. And that became an issue during the nominating contest this year. I am convinced, based on his record and also what he's said, that if he is elected president, he will begin his administration by reaching out to Republicans, both rank and file, and especially leaders. The bourbon that Barack Obama famously declined to enjoy with Mitch McConnell, I think will occur very quickly in Mr. Biden's presidency, if there is a Biden presidency. What I hear from people close to the Biden campaign is that he is determined to begin his administration by putting on the table bills that he believes will, if not be acceptable to Republicans, at least be negotiable. And then to begin by having and taking charge of serious negotiations, not outsourcing that simply to congressional leaders. And I've heard it described as a probationary period for the Republican minority, if it does turn out to be a Republican minority, that he does not personally want to abolish the legislative filibuster. It's something he would do as a last resort and not a first resort. On the other hand, he will not allow his presidency to be wrecked on the shoals of the kind of obstructionism that I think Vanessa was pointing to in a previous comment. And so we have a chance to begin to unravel or at least halt the vicious cycle. And I believe that a President Biden would want to do that and work to do that and give it some months to see how it plays out. But as I said, he's not willing to have his entire program simply shelved or gridlocked by obstruction. And if it is, I think he will be reluctantly led to the conclusion that a change, particularly in the Senate rules, is unavoidable and inevitable.
And can I just add, let me add one thing to that. I think the other thing that'll have to happen in the next 4 years is something that did not happen after 2012. After 2012, the Republican National Committee brought together a group and they put together a report. The report just looked at basic demographic trends and they said, we have to change. We have to change because the country is changing. The millennial generation is has the highest percentage of men and women of color of any generation in American politics. They're going to, as they grow up and get older, they will vote more often. We know that about voting. The Republicans will have to change. Now, this was obviously thrown by the wayside, and Donald Trump managed to win the Republican nomination and win the presidency by the way, getting very lucky, getting very lucky in 3 states. So the question will be, what does the Republican Party writ large, right, do if they suffer a wipeout, okay? Do they take that report from 2012 off the shelf? And it particularly, by the way, warned about the increasing strength of the Latino vote. Do they take it off the shelf and look at what's happened and say, oh my God, we got to do something? One of the things that will convince them to take that look is going to be Texas. Okay, Texas is ridiculously close between Biden and Trump. I will still bet that it goes for Trump, but it's absurdly close. It looks like we could pick up, or Democrats could pick up 6 House seats in Texas. Margins are going to close for a lot of the Republicans. Texas is going to be a kind of touchstone, I think, for a lot of Republicans in deciding how they behave and what their party is. Are they going to disappear into a radical fringe of white supremacists, or are they going to try to adjust themselves to the reality of America in the first quarter of the 21st century? And frankly, that decision on their part is going to go a long way towards answering the question of how polarized will we be after this election.
You know, Elaine, just to pick up on that point quickly, I think there are a lot of us who believe that Donald Trump does have a chance of winning this election next week. I think there are very few of us who believe that Donald Trump will win the popular vote next week. I think if he wins, it'll be a similar track to 2016. That will mean that in 7 out of the last 8 elections, Republicans lost the popular vote. And to put it into even greater perspective, by 2024, you will have voters who never lived in America in which a Republican won the popular vote. I mean, that's staggering. And so to your point, and to Vanessa's point before, and Bill's as well about realignment rather, sorry, there is a real need for some sort of reset as this sort of path to victory dwindles for a party, and that maybe it's that 2012 postmortem, maybe it is a new postmortem, but I think regardless of a Trump win or a Trump loss, the fact that it will almost certainly be a popular vote loss for Republicans requires some sort of reset moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, I think to all of these points, I mean, it's really about, the question is about fighting for the soul of the nation. And I mean, it's very clear when it comes to Trump. I mean, as Bill has said, and Elaine, and you just highlighted, John, I mean, look, when I think about it, is in places where Trump campaigned at in 2016, hate crimes increased 200%. No one wants to deal with that. We also know his recent, not only kind of rolling back of implicit bias trainings and other sorts of things are things that people also don't want, but we also see his actual behavior, not only there, but in his appeals court selections, that none of them have been Black. And in a place like Texas, which we were just talking about, some of those groups of judges were the ones who ruled that there could only be one mail-in ballot drop-off box in each county. I mean, Texas is huge. I mean, trying to go across a county, if you don't live by that mail-in ballot, I mean, it could take you a very, very long time, potentially an hour or two. On the other hand, we have Biden, who came out and acknowledged that systemic racism exists. Also, him being a moderate, being willing to reach across the aisle, to have conversations, to come up with the plan, to compromise. That's always been what Biden has done. And I think for a lot of people, they think America needs that. I think there are a couple other things that's going to push him as well, though. It's not only the diversity of the House, but also potentially the diverse ideas in the Senate. We know right now there are tons of women running for the Senate. There are more Black people running for the Senate than we potentially had before. It's unclear who of those are going to win, but it's 6 or 7 of them in some interesting states. I mean, South Carolina, that you mentioned earlier with Jamie Harrison potentially being one of the most interesting, as well as Georgia. But who's going to be Biden's vice president if he wins? That's Kamala Harris. Now, both of them have a questionable record when it comes to criminal justice reform. And I still don't think either one of them have a good answer there. Kamala Harris has essentially aimed to avoid a lot of the questions. When Biden's asked about it, I don't think his answers have been adequate. But one thing that's clear is that he's going to take the model they did under the Obama-Biden administration and put together essentially a 21st century policing task force redo that will come up with some legislation that can hopefully move things forward. Because I think that's been one of the biggest thorns for the Biden-Harris ticket, particularly as it relates to people in urban communities and particularly with the Black community.
Well, anyone on the Biden campaign who happens to be watching, if there is a reboot of the 21st century policing task force, the person who should chair that commission is on this panel right now in Ray Sean, for sure. So I will give that plug for him. But to pick up on your point, actually, Ray Sean, we have a question from Joseph. Polls show that President Trump is doing a little better with Black and Latino voters than he did in 2016. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. People have been trying to figure this out. I think the bottom line is this. I think part of it is what I just mentioned, that the Trump campaign and people who are supporting Trump have aimed to frame Joe Biden as having a nearly 50-year track record of participating in incarcerating young Black people, particularly young Black men. Now, Bill and I wrote about this for FixGov, about the 1994 crime bill. People should read that. It's much more complex than people think, but directly to the question, it's also about the fact that a lot of people in particular demographics primarily get their news from social media. So they're not seeing longer form type of journalism that many of us do. People are seeing sound bites. They're seeing short clips. They're seeing Joe Biden have a conversation with Charlemagne, who is a radio personality in New York, make certain statements that have been used in various ways. Those sort of things gain steam. And one of the things I spend a lot of time doing is just doing an autocorrect of what is true and what's not. And I think for a lot of people, they do that. But I think that's part of what's going on. The other thing I think, though, is that Blacks and Latinos are saying, look, we're not going to simply allow Democrats to take our votes for granted. Instead, we expect some changes to be made. And that gets back to what I was saying before. I think once they get into the polls, once they fill out their ballots, overwhelming majority are going to still vote for Biden. But what they're saying is you can't simply take our vote for granted. There are things that we want out of this situation. But I also think, finally, there's a reconfiguration happening that we've been talking about, and it spans the United States, and it also comes to Blacks and Latinos as well. If we go back nearly a century, but maybe the 30s and 40s and 50s, we have to remember that when the civil rights movement started, many of the Black people who started the civil rights movement were considered Republicans, right? There's this big debate about MLK and what his political affiliation would have been. I think it's very clear he would be supporting Black Lives Matter and what's going on there. But part of that is speaking to the fact that people are saying we have an overly simplistic two-party system. The same way the Tea Party Republicans are grouped in with moderate Republicans, we have fissures on the left as well. And Blacks span and Latinos span the political gradient. They are not homogeneous groups. And part of it, for those of us who are really into this, we really appreciate the complexities that are being pulled out of voters that are oftentimes viewed as a monolithic block. And people are saying we are not the same. We have different thoughts. We have different views. And that is something that Democrats and Republicans should pay attention to.
May I add just one point to Rashawn's analysis? And I may be wrong about this, but as I look at the surveys, both in 2016 and particularly this year, I see the president making a lot more progress with Black and Latino men than with the women in those groups. President Trump's version of masculinity has a differential appeal, and it attracts some men almost as much as it repels many women. And we're going to see a gender gap among whites. And it's not at all surprising to see Mr. Trump widening that gap among non-white populations in the country as well. I don't know whether you agree with that, Rashawn, but that's what I'm seeing in the numbers anyway.
I mean, completely so. And I don't know if I said this earlier, but in 2016, 1 out of 6 college-educated Black men voted for Trump. I think that could actually grow, and is growing, to your point, among men writ large because of how Trump embodies a particular masculinity, as you're highlighting, that, to be realistic, Black and Latino men actually want to embody and can't because of race, is what's so ironic about it. And so they are literally trying to channel symbolically and figuratively what they envision to have as it relates to masculinity and what Trump does via him for themselves. And I mean, it's something that's highly problematic. I mean, when we look at Black women continue to be one of the pillars that carries the Democratic Party. That is not the case for Black men. And so the conversations that were being held in 2016 in white households between white men and white women is also happening in Black households between Black men and Black women. And we really have to pay attention to gender. I mean, Trump is he's really nicking away at this, and he's doing a really, really good job of it based on some of the reactions that men have to really privileging the economy, oftentimes over their everyday experiences and family.
All right, time for a couple more questions as we wind down to a finish. The next is from Nancy George, who asks, how do you think the results of the election will impact American political influence around the world?
I'll take a first crack at that. To judge from the best surveys, coming out of, let's say, the Pew Research Center and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, foreign evaluations of American leadership have plunged to an all-time low. And Mr. Trump's way of doing business, his America First principles, have not played well around the world. On the contrary. And if you look at some of the recent statements coming out of Europe, Europeans would interpret Mr. Trump's reelection as a clear, unmistakable signal that all of the assumptions inherited from the Second World War were now obsolete, and that Europeans would have to make their own arrangements. And they would refuse to make a choice between the United States and China. They would think of themselves more as a middle force between Russia and the United States than as an ally of the United States in some sort of struggle against Russian influence. So from the standpoint of foreign policy, this is a game being played for very high stakes. And the entire notion of American leadership in the world, as contested as that is, I think would have to be put on the shelf, depending on the results of the election. Some of the damage may be permanent, some may be reversible. There's a big debate in Europe on that question. But these are the facts, and there's no gainsaying them.
And just to flag for our viewers, next week on Monday, Brookings Foreign Policy Program, in conjunction with the Brookings Doha Center, will be hosting an event called How Will the 2020 Presidential Election Shape U.S. Policy in the Middle East? And I think that question will be a big part of that conversation as well. All right, for my last question, hold on, sorry, I have to find it on the sheet. It's from a viewer named Fu Chen, who talks a bit about how the COVID pandemic has really brought to light just what a patchwork of an election system it is in the United States, and the dysfunction that can happen with elections administered at the state level. Do you think, given what we've gone through, first in a primary season and now in a general election, if you think after 2020 there will be any appetite for Congress to take action to try to take steps towards some form of standardization of elections, or to build some sort of protections in against the types of events that we've seen this year?
Let me take that on, John. I think what we have to do is re-look at how we look at this patchwork. A, it's in the Constitution, so that's one problem. States do have authority over elections. B, however, what we saw in 2016, and I think what we've been seeing this time, is that there are actually some advantages to states running elections and having control over elections. A fully nationalized system means that it is actually easier for foreign intervention. It is easier for disruptions, the kind of disruptions that we know Russia tried to do last time around and largely failed at it, but they were trying to get into the election networks. So I think that ironically, there is some level of protection against misbehavior and foreign intervention in having every state run its own election system. That doesn't mean that we can't do things. We can't do things through the courts. We can't reinstate Shelby. We can't do things in the courts to protect people's civil rights. That's a different question. But in terms of the administration of elections, it is very dangerous to think that we can go to some sort of national election system, because frankly, it makes us, I think, vulnerable in different ways. Right now, you have to be playing in over 3,000 counties, and their own method of putting together ballots, collecting ballots, et cetera, to do some real mischief there. And ironically, that may help us at least against foreign intervention.
I would just add to keep in mind that, and granted, it was 2 decades ago, but after the 2000 debacle in Florida, we did see in 2002, I guess, the Help America Vote Act, right? Some assertion of federal control to try to at least clean up some of the difficulties of voting technology. And it's possible that this round of patchwork confusion elicits more attention to mail-in voting, I think, by the states. But and it may be that today's partisanship precludes that type of national federal response. But there is at least past model here for reacting at the federal level to that state patchwork, with all the advantages and disadvantages that Elaine pointedly points out.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for an engaging discussion today, 1 week out from the presidential election. We'll all be waiting to see next Tuesday what the results are, and maybe for a couple of days after that. I'd also like to thank our viewers, our governance studies team for helping put this together. You can follow each of us on Twitter. I also encourage you to check out one of Brookings' newest blogs from our Race, Prosperity and Inclusion Initiative, called How We Rise, and you can follow all of our election analysis, both pre and post, on our FixGov blog, where Elaine and I are editors. We'll also have a post-election event next week. You can check that out on Brookings' events page. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.